Kelly, Director of Libraries for the City of Cambridge, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event with Ambassador Nicholas Burns. I also want to acknowledge present library trustees Karen Costco and Nancy Woods. I would like to thank Drew Griffin and the CPL Communications team for putting this event together, and to thank all of you for participating. This evening's lecture is happening under the auspices of the Our Path Forward series, which examines issues that are critical to the health of our democracy. As a place of learning and community connection, the Cambridge Public Library is delighted to be a place for this timely conversation to occur. Thank you for being here, Ambassador Burns. I look very much forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Maria. Who knew when you put Our Path Forward together many years ago that how needful it would be in our community? It's been wonderful, and I'm so glad that we can bring Ambassador Burns here tonight to participate in it. And thanks to the library for all their support in this. Some of you may remember that 4 years ago, we had the pleasure of Ambassador Burns speaking to us about the foreign policy challenges before the current administration. And he laid out what at that time was I thought just a wonderful evening. Over these last 4 years, many things have changed and things are not quite what they were 4 years ago. We can point out our adversaries in China and Russia and North Korea and perhaps Iran. We can point out weaknesses now with our allies, especially in Europe. But I'm going to, kind of stay away from that because I want Nick to talk about what he thinks is important and not give him too much, guidance. Nick is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He was for 27 years a member of the State Department. He worked in Africa and the Middle East. He was the director of Soviet affairs under George H.W. Bush. Under Clinton, he was on the National Security Council. He was a spokesman of the Department of State, and he was the ambassador of Greece. And then under George W. Bush, he was the U.S. representative to NATO, especially important because that was during the Iraq War. And then he ended his career as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, which is the highest civil service position in the State Department. He is also a local guy. He grew up in Wellesley. He went to BC, and he currently resides in Cambridge. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Nicholas Burns to speak on the foreign policy challenges facing the Biden-Harris administration.
Drew, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you again, a pleasure to see a lot of friends on this call. I want to pay tribute to Drew first. He and I are now somewhat related. Drew has an extraordinarily brilliant and very nice son named Dylan. And Dylan is an executive at Twitter. But his real claim to fame is that he married our niece, Rebecca Burns, Dr. Rebecca Burns. And so Drew and I know each other from that family relationship. I just wanted to start and thank our health professionals, because I think all of us who live in Massachusetts owe a lot, not just to the brilliance of our hospital system, but to the men and women, the nurses, the doctors, the orderlies, the technicians, the custodial staff who keeps our hospitals going at a time of crisis, of pandemic. And Drew's daughter-in-law, Dr. Rebecca Burns, is one of those people at Boston City. Her sister, one of our other nieces, Dr. Kate Burns, is at Children's Hospital, along with their dad, my brother, Dr. Jeff Burns. Forgive the family focus, but I thought I should thank through them all of our health professionals who are keeping us safe at this terrible time. I'm really pleased to be here as I just zoomed through the roster here, I saw Brooks and Jeannie Goddard, two of the best teachers ever at Wellesley High School. And it's so great to see them here. It's great to see Sophronia Camp, who's a resident of Cambridge, but also Dartmouth. And we know her through her brother. One of the great American archaeologists of our time is Dr. John Camp, who heads the dig at the Agora in Athens, in Greece. Very pleased to see Professor Dr. Mark O'Connor, my mentor from Boston College, my first professor as a freshman in the fall of 1974. And Dan Kahn of Cambridge, Mass. He and his wife went with Libby and I to China a year and a half ago for 10 days in that fascinating country. So great to see everyone. I've been asked to talk about foreign policy, but I first want to praise the library, Maria, Drew, everybody concerned with it. We're so proud of the Public Library of Cambridge. It's one of the great institutions that my wife Libby and I, our daughter Elizabeth also lives in Cambridge, love about the city. Einstein said the following about libraries. He said, the only thing that you absolutely have to know is the location of the library. And as on many issues, scientific and philosophical, Einstein, of course, was exactly right about libraries in general, but we would like to say about the Cambridge Public Library specifically. So I'm looking forward to a good conversation tonight. I'm going to talk about America and the world, about American foreign policy, about what we have to do to keep ourselves safe here in America, but also to fulfill our responsibilities as one of 195 countries in the world to achieve a world that's more just, that's more peaceful, that's more stable. That's what we should want to do as we set out in the world as a country. But we can't talk about foreign policy if we don't talk about what's happening here on the home front. And I want to start by stating what's on my mind, and I suspect it's in the minds of many of you tonight. And that is that our country's standing has always rested not just on the strength of our military or the power of the American dollar or America's vast political influence in the world. It really rests on how true we are to the principles of our country, the foundation of our country. And the foundation, of course, is our commitment through the Constitution, through the Declaration of Independence, through the Bill of Rights, to human freedom, to democracy, to the rule of law, playing by the rules. Winners win and losers concede. And that's what's really at stake the night before we have our peaceful transition of power from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Our effectiveness overseas, and I've lived in 7 countries since I was a 17-year-old student, exchange student from Wellesley High School to Luxembourg, 7 countries. What I've always found is that our effectiveness overseas depends on our ability to be stable at home and to be successful at home. And so I'm going to state the obvious here on January 19th, 2021. We have to repair our shattered glass house here at home. If we have a hope and a prayer of being respected overseas, of being listened to overseas, and effective overseas. And like many of you, I do not underestimate the damage that has been done to our country over the last 4 years, and I'll just state the obvious, but I suspect I'm in a deep blue bubble, so it's safe to state the obvious. I was an opponent of Donald Trump over the last 4 years, and a proponent of the people who wanted to lift up our country, people like Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris, the people who ran to succeed him, but specifically of Joe Biden. And I don't underestimate the damage that has happened since Joe Biden's victory, his clear victory on November 3rd. I do think this is the most difficult moment that we have faced as a country since the combination of the Great Depression and the Second World War of 80 years ago. Think of the 4 interlocking crises that we're facing. I know we all think about them every day. The crisis of the pandemic. We hit the terrible, terrible mark of 400,000 dead in our country today. And the incoming Biden administration is expecting that we'll be at 500,000 dead Americans this winter. and maybe a much worse death toll by the spring. We've had a disorganized, and that's charitable, federal government effort. President Trump, the history books will say, quit on the pandemic sometime early in the spring of 2020. He never mentions it. He doesn't work on it. He's paid no attention to what his own government is doing. And now we see this disjointed effort between the federal government not helping the states, the 50 states, to cope in the way that they should in a national emergency. The pandemic is ruling our lives, and it instills fear, I think, in all of us, and doubt and anxiety about our families, about our friends, about our country. And that's combined with the crisis of the recession. Economists will say this is the most severe recession since that of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inauguration, his first inauguration in March of 1933. Millions of Americans out of work, and because of our system, millions of Americans who've lost health care tied to their jobs. All this with small business failures, with doubt. How am I going to repay my student debt? How will I pay the mortgage if I don't have a job? Imagine what's happening around dinner tables. We all know what's happening around kitchen and dinner tables in our country. And this takes place against the backdrop of this growing inequality of income and of opportunity in our own country, which is perilous for our future if we think about the stability of our country and how we relate to each other, those who are wealthy, those who are middle income, those in a bigger group and a growing group of those in a low income status. And related to those two crises of the pandemic and the recession, of course, is the crisis of race. We all saw what happened this summer. We all saw what happened in those cases of police brutality against African American men and African American women. We saw a more hopeful side of America when millions of people of all colors, all faiths, all ethnicities went into the streets in what is now considered to be the largest set of demonstrations in the history of the country to demonstrate for racial justice and racial equality. I think it's the most difficult crisis on race since April, May, June of 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated. We white Americans, and a lot of us here, as I look through, are white, we have to stand up and we have to be counted in the ranks of those who believe in racial justice. Those three crises alone would have tested our most brilliant presidents: Washington, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Barack Obama. But there's a fourth, and it's the constitutional crisis that was launched shortly after November 3rd, when the president failed to do what every single one of his predecessors had done, who had lost an election: accept the loss, congratulate the victor, prepare for the peaceful transition of power. I don't need to rehearse the chapter and verse of what has happened in those intervening few months. We've all been glued to our television and our newspapers, and we've all felt the repercussions of this crisis when the real foundations of our democracy have been tested. And the events of January 6th in particular, an assault on the Capitol of the United States, deserve a little bit of attention tonight. I was just thinking through our history that I learned in Wellesley High School and at Boston College on the night of January 6th. How many times in American history has the Capitol of the United States, either the building or the city, been attacked? Well, we know 1814, when the British burned Washington. We know August 1864, when the Confederate General Jubal Early attacked with the cavalry Washington. They wanted to kidnap Lincoln and end the war. They did not succeed. We know that on 9/11, Al-Qaeda attacked the Capitol just across the river. And of course, one of those airplanes struck the Pentagon and killed hundreds of people. This is the only other time in American history when a mob of insurrectionists, lawless, depraved, violent people attacked the Capitol, and attacked it at a particular time when the Congress was meeting to certify the election of Joe Biden and the defeat of Donald Trump. This poses a dual challenge to the core of our democracy. When a majority of House Republicans voted that night after the attack, and that just adds to their everlasting shame, when they voted to decertify, not recognize President Biden's victory, it was an unprecedented moment in the history of the United States, only rivaled by what the Southern Confederate States did in the spring and summer and autumn of 1860. The members of Congress who voted to decertify did it on the basis of no evidence. 60 courts adjudicated the facts and said there is no compelling evidence that would constitute fraud in the elections of the 4 contested states. The Supreme Court twice rejected the pleas of President Trump, and yet members of one party decided to disregard all that for the first time in American history. That should cause us deep concern. And the second aspect of this is the rise of these violent militia groups threatening the rule of law, threatening our social order, threatening our democracy. The Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers. If those among them attack the Capitol, I'm for the FBI finding them, arresting them, indicting them, prosecuting them, convicting them, and jailing them for sedition, for insurrection, for unlawful entry at that time in that building, in that Capitol. So the bottom line is, our national crisis at home is directly linked to our foreign policy, and it has had a profoundly negative impact on how the rest of the world sees us. I hear from a lot of my friends, and I'm sure a lot of you hear from friends and relatives overseas, and Libby and I have 2 daughters living overseas, so we get real-time reports from Argentina and from Germany. People look at us and think, what has happened to the United States? So divided, so disputatious, red-blue divisions, north-south divisions, urban-rural divisions, coastal versus mid-America, a dysfunctional Congress that can't decide much of anything. Let's hope that changes tomorrow. You can imagine how our adversaries are reacting. I've been paying attention to what the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson and the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespeople have been saying. They are glorying in our problems. They paint a picture of America as a failing democracy, a representative of a failing system, and they tout the advantages of authoritarianism when they depict the scenes on our streets. Our allies, our best friends, the Germans, the French, the British, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, our treaty allies, they're worried about us. How do we know if Joe Biden comes back to us, if Donald Trump or someone like him won't come back in 2024 is a question I've received countless times since November 3rd. And it pains me to hear this, and it'll pain you too. But a lot of my friends overseas are saying now, can you even lead the world as the greatest democratic power if your own house is in such disorder? So I wanted to start there because it's the only place to start when we think about America's relationship to the rest of the world. Here's the better news. And I'm going to end this on hope, by the way, so I'm not going to depress everybody after dinner here in Cambridge. What can we expect of Joe Biden as of 12:01 p.m. tomorrow when he takes the oath of office, of Kamala Harris when she takes the oath of office? And what an incredible moment that will be. First female vice president, first African-American vice president, first South Asian American vice president. It's going to be history tomorrow. I think President Biden is going to arrive in the Oval Office at 3 or 4 tomorrow afternoon. He's going to be the best prepared president we've ever had in foreign policy, along with George H.W. Bush, who of course had a storied foreign policy career before he became president in 1989. And President Biden is building a cabinet and a sub-cabinet I think of almost unrivaled experience and competence in people like our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, our new ambassador at the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, our new National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, our new Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and the rest of the cabinet, including Governor Gina Raimondo of next door in Rhode Island. This is a cabinet built on people who know what they're doing, who've served in Washington, or in the case of Governor Raimondo, in an important state capital. This is a cabinet, I think, that is going to make us proud, and they're going to work hard. There aren't going to be a lot of not going to be a lot of boasts on Twitter. We're not going to have a soap opera daily or a national crisis daily manufactured by the president. We're going to have a sober, serious, hardworking administration that fits the time. Biden, in my judgment, I've known him since the 1990s. He's a uniter. He's a healer. He's very pragmatic. He's middle of the road. He's experienced. He understands that our constitutional system was built on compromise and built on different parties and different people working together. It sounds so refreshing and so American when you describe him, at least it does to me, that way. He's going to have to prioritize the home front. A lot of people have been asking me, people overseas, journalists, well, how much time is Biden going to spend overseas, and how many trips is he going to make in his first year? And I tell people, expect him to be focused on the United States, on the pandemic, on the economic crisis, on the racial crisis, on the constitutional crisis, on the violence of these far right militia groups, and expect him to spend probably a little bit less time on his preferred area of expertise, which is foreign policy. But he will be active in foreign policy. What will he do? I think there'll be 5 priorities that I can see over the next year. Priority number 1 on foreign policy. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Tony Blinken will put the United States back at the leadership table on foreign affairs. We'll be even back at the table because Donald Trump took us out of so many global institutions. Tomorrow afternoon, President Biden will issue a series of executive orders. Among them will be an executive order that returns the United States to the World Health Organization. It's not a perfect organization. They should have pushed the Chinese in a much tougher way a year ago this month at the beginning of the pandemic. But it's the only game in town. It's the only public health organization that unites 195 countries and 7.6 billion people. That's the human race. At a time of pandemic, for us to have left the table, disgraceful. Taken our money away from poor countries that need it, disgraceful. Joe Biden's going to put us back into that institution tomorrow afternoon. The second executive order is he's going to put us back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We're the second largest carbon emitter. How can the world confront the climate change crisis of today and the next several decades without the United States, without our technological prowess, without our scientists, without our companies, without our funding, without our effort? Back at the leadership table on issue after issue, in institution after institution, most of which we created, by the way. Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy created many of these international institutions in the United Nations system. Some of them based here in the United States that President Trump summarily left will be going back in under Joe Biden. That's priority number 1. Back at the table, talking to the rest of the world, not yelling, not tweeting, not insulting, treating people respectfully. It's going to be refreshing. Priority number 2, I think the biggest change I can see is the prominence of climate change on the agenda and in the cabinet. John Kerry is going to be the first cabinet level official ever charged with being the leader on climate change and the president's personal representative. Gina McCarthy is going to be back in the administration, this time at the White House, coordinating climate change. Several of the cabinet secretaries, including Mayor Pete Buttigieg, have been told by the president, your primary or one of your primary responsibilities, no matter what your basic responsibility is, labor. We've got a lot of New Englanders and Massachusetts people in these positions, and transportation, climate change. And so I think this administration is going to be put forward the most aggressive, most clear commitment that the United States is behind the global effort to mitigate the worst aspects of climate change of any administration. And I should note, talking about the development of the cabinet, this will certainly be the most diverse cabinet in American history. More women, more African Americans, more Latinx Americans, more Asian Americans, more diversity by race, ethnicity, and gender than any administration in history. That was Biden's commitment. He's already delivered on it in his cabinet and among the people I know going in at the sub-cabinet level. It's exciting to see. Change is coming. Third priority, alliances. Drew mentioned that I was American ambassador to NATO. I was for 3.5 years during 9/11 and during the beginning of the conflicts and after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Our great advantage in the world against our two primary adversaries, Russia and China, is that we have treaty alliances and they don't. What does that mean? We have NATO. We have Canada and 28 European countries that are linked to us by treaty, by mutual defense treaty. They have our back and we have their back. On the morning of 9/11, when we were hit really hard, I was a brand new ambassador, 12 days at NATO. And I couldn't reach the Pentagon and State Department and White House because they'd been evacuated in the hour after the attack. And my phone started ringing, and it wasn't Washington. It was David Wright, the Canadian ambassador. It was Gebhard von Moltke, the German ambassador. It was my friend Jerzy Nowak, the Polish ambassador. Have you thought about invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty? Article 5, an attack on one of us shall be deemed an attack on all of us. And we had never had to invoke it in Cold War history because we were too strong for the Soviets, from Stalin all the way to Brezhnev. But we were attacked on 9/11. And the next morning we invoked Article 5. And every single one of those NATO allies went into Afghanistan with us. And the great majority are still there. The Russians have nobody who will stand up for them in a crisis like that. And the Chinese don't either. And in East Asia, we have Japan and South Korea and Australia as our treaty allies, and the Philippines and Thailand as our security partners, and a very important major strategic defense relationship forming with India, soon to be the largest country in the world. The Chinese have nobody who will defend them, and we have all those countries. It's the great power differential. They are, these alliances east and west between us and Russia, us and China, and Joe Biden is going to put us back into leadership. Donald Trump, he's been NATO's leading critic in Western Europe. Donald Trump has been South Korea's leading critic in East Asia. Joe Biden is going to be the leading champion, and that just restores the America that Eisenhower believed in, that Kennedy believed in, that Reagan believed in, that the Bushes and Barack Obama believed in. That's the third priority. Rebuild the alliances that are so critical to our future. Fourth priority, the United States and China. This is going to be, it already is, the most difficult, most challenging, and most important bilateral relationship that we have with any country in the world. China and the United States and China in that order, are the two leading economies in the world. We're the two most advanced countries technologically in the world. We are the two most politically persuasive and powerful countries in the world. And we're going to be locked in a competition for power across all those domains for the next 20 or 30 years. It's going to test us like nothing before. We thought the Cold War was hard. It was. But the Soviet Union was never anywhere close in terms of its global power to what China has today. I think we'll be contesting China, and they will be contesting us across 4 fields. First, we're going to be competitors for military power. In the Indo-Pacific, the United States has been the primary military power in that part of the world since the Japanese surrender in September 1945. The Chinese pushing out Blue Water Navy, advanced ballistic missiles, advanced fighter aircraft. They're challenging us. We don't want to fight. We would be insane, China and the United States, both of us, to fall into war accidentally or purposefully because of the consequences in the nuclear weapons world, but we have to compete with each other, and we'll be competing militarily. We'll also be competing, as you can imagine, technologically, and particularly in those technological areas that are going to be critical for economic and military success in this decade and the next. That's biotechnology and AI and machine learning and quantum sciences. It'll be our MIT engineers and our Stanford, University of Illinois, University of Texas engineers competing with our tech companies against the Chinese in the civilian realm. But the Chinese are militarizing these technologies in an ambitious attempt to leapfrog over the United States militarily in terms of its technical capacity. And we just simply can't let that happen. To allow the largest and most powerful authoritarian government in the world to become the world's strongest military power, it's inconceivable the United States would do that. So the competition is underway there. It's certainly underway, the competition economically. A lot of American companies put at a disadvantage by the fact that China does not honor patent law, does not honor intellectual property rights. And this is part of the seed corn, if you will, the strength of the American economy. It's in those areas. And so we have to have a level playing field. And the fourth battle between the United States and China is it's ideological. It sounds like the Cold War. It's a little bit reminiscent of it, but it's very different. Xi Jinping, who's now the strongest Chinese leader since Mao, is saying quite regularly he thinks the authoritarian system that China has developed is superior to the democratic system. That's exactly what Vladimir Putin thinks. It's what President Erdogan of Turkey thinks. It's what the autocratic Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary thinks. It's not what we think, or what the Japanese think, or what the Indians, Australians, Koreans, Germans, French, British, Nigerians, South Africans think. And the Brazilians and Argentinians don't think it either. We're all democracies. We're imperfect. Maybe we're not as efficient. We're certainly not, because we're democratic, because we honor citizen rights and human rights. This is a real challenge. This is a Chinese government that has actively, this past summer during the pandemic, smothered Hong Kong's democracy. It's over, unfortunately, tragically, in Hong Kong. There is no longer a democracy there as they arrest those young, courageous democracy leaders just over the last couple of weeks. It's a Chinese government that has been bullying Vietnam and the Philippines and the South China Sea over their territorial differences. It's a Chinese government that stoked a conflict with India high up in the Himalayas, 13,000 feet, between the two largest militaries in the world along their 2,500-mile border this past summer. We do not want to fight China. And China's not our enemy. It's an adversary. But we have to keep up with it, and we have to contain it. And that's going to be the focus of this relationship. It's not our enemy, so we're going to try to cooperate, and we should, with the Chinese. As we compete in the areas I've talked about, we certainly should cooperate on the pandemic. We certainly should cooperate on climate change. There are things we can do with the Chinese, but we have to be present for the competition as well. That's the fourth Biden priority, the US-China relationship that I see. And the fifth is democracy promotion around the world. Donald Trump, alone among modern presidents, never lifted a finger to help Democrats, small d Democrats, around the world. His buddies were Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and President Erdogan of Turkey. He was the leading critic of Angela Merkel and of Justin Trudeau and of Emmanuel Macron. He kind of took American foreign policy and what we believe, that we support our friends and contest our adversaries, and he turned it on its head in kind of an Alice in Wonderland foreign policy. And so Joe Biden, fundamentally dedicated to supporting democratic countries when they're assaulted from within by far-right populist movements like Marine Le Pen in France or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. We need to be in that struggle. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan would have been in it. Donald Trump has not been in it. Joe Biden is going to speak up for democracy. Those are the five priorities that I see. Finally, before we get to your questions, comments too, by the way, what's on your mind? There is hope. You may not think it after that race through the domestic and foreign policy challenges of the United States to which I've just subjected you, but there is hope. We are a country of enormous strength, and we shouldn't forget it. Our business community is part of the strength of this country and of our economy, our entrepreneurial spirit, our innovators, our small business owners, our civics organization. I just spoke to the Rotary Club of Providence, Rhode Island at lunch today. Really public-spirited people. Trump supporters, Biden supporters, Americans first. That's the sense I got of lunch today. So we're strong because of the people and institutions in this country. We're strong because of immigration. And I think Joe Biden, you're going to see another executive order tomorrow, I think, on immigration. We're an immigrant nation. We're stronger because of our immigrant past and our immigrant future. Economists will tell you that as we take in about 1 million legal immigrants a year, and that's what we've been doing since the 1960s, it's made us the second youngest of all the strongest powers in the world demographically, and that makes us economically stronger. It also is ethically right, because if we went around this Zoom call tonight, it'd be really fun to do. And I asked the question, where are you from? I didn't mean you're on Village or Kendall Square or Harvard Square, but where are you from? We all have an immigrant story. We all have an immigrant story, and that's the key feature of foundational stone of America. It makes us completely different, along with Canada, than just about every country in the world. We're going to honor our immigrant past, and that strengthens us. And it's also good to remember our history. We have been through, I think, 3 more challenging times in the past. The revolution was more challenging than what we're going through now. It was sink or swim, and it was live or die. The Civil War, certainly more challenging, certainly more fateful, certainly more damaging to the country. On a lasting basis, we're still not quite recovered when some depraved individual paraded through the Capitol on January 6th with a Confederate flag. What a desecration of the Capitol, Lincoln's Capitol, to have that happen. And certainly the Great Depression and World War II of many of our parents, those of us in this Zoom call, much more difficult, frankly, over 12 years than what we're facing now. We should take some courage from our history. How did those Americans get through their crises? How did they unite? How did they manage to succeed against all odds? So we should believe that we have the capacity to have hope, to overcome these crises, to pull together, and having a good leader, having a leader that appeals to Lincoln's better angels of our nature is going to be a really hopeful moment, starting for me at least, at 12:01 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. Let me leave you with a quote and just a little bit of poetry, and I'm going to come to a close, and we're going to have a discussion. A year ago this week, I was in Washington. It was an amazing time in America. You could actually get on airplanes without masks. You could shake people's hands. It was that world that we've all left behind. I went to Washington for an Aspen Institute conference. I interviewed in a public forum on C-SPAN Condoleezza Rice. Condi Rice is a close friend of my wife and I. I've worked for her twice in my Foreign Service career. I asked her the following question: what do you worry about the most? And what I thought I was asking was, are you worried about Iran, North Korea, Putin, China, the Middle East? What is it? And without missing a blink, she answered very quickly. She said, we've lost our self-confidence. She answered a different question. She answered about what's happened to us at home. This is last January. We've lost our self-confidence. I said, what do you mean by that? She said, and I'm just paraphrasing, no matter who we are, left, right, center, Republican, Democrat, we're an exceptional nation. We have a vital role to play in the world. And we Americans have lost the ability to think that we have something to offer to the world because we've been so consumed by our problems here at home. I was really struck by that. I've told my students about that. We've lost our self-confidence. Churchill tried to give us self-confidence when he came to Cambridge, Massachusetts, September 6, 1943, to receive an honorary degree at Harvard. And he told a crowd in Memorial Hall, he said, "The price of greatness is responsibility. You Americans are now the greatest power in the world." He said, "One cannot rise to be in many ways the leading community in the world without being involved in its problems, convulsed by its agonies, and inspired by its causes." Churchill, Condi Rice. Americans have to be self-confident. We play such a large role in the world for our own security and safety and out of the world. We have to rise to the occasion. So let's be hopeful. For those of us who remembered Richard Nixon, our long national nightmare is nearly over. Tonight's the final night. Tomorrow we begin again. And my friend Dan Mulhall, the Irish ambassador of the United States, sent me and about 1 million other Americans a Christmas card this year. And just a couple of lines, he included a couple of lines of poetry from the great modern Irish poet, Derek Mahon. And Drew, I thought, and Maria, since it's a library setting, a couple of lines of poetry to end this endlessly long set of remarks by me. Here's Derek Mahon to give us some hope. The poems flow from the heart unbidden, and the hidden source is the watchful heart. The sun rises in spite of everything, and the far cities are beautiful and bright. I lie here in a riot of sunlight, watching the day break and the clouds flying. Everything is going to be all right. Thank you. So Drew, happy to talk to anybody, answer any questions that are on people's minds.
Okay, thank you for that. That was extraordinary, a master class in about 40 minutes. And there's nothing better than ending with poetry, at least in my mind. So thank you for that as well. I was going to ask this anyways, but somebody has brought it up in the chat, a more personal question. There have been stories over the last 4 years of the hollowing out of the State Department. Many people have left, people have been fired. How will that, what is the state of the State Department right now? How will that affect the Biden-Harris agenda? And what can Biden-Harris team do to strengthen the State Department?
Drew, thank you. And thanks to the person who asked that question. I feel this deeply because I was a Foreign Service officer career. We serve both, like all other civil servants, we serve both Republican and Democratic administrations, and our oath is not to the president. Nobody takes an oath to the president in our society. It's always to the Constitution. And right now, I go back 40 years in the State Department to the summer of 1980. Morale is as low tonight as it's ever been. The Foreign Service has been, in the words of the millennials, disrespected by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who's called the State Department, the career people, part of the deep state. Lack of funding, the summary firings of some of our senior officers at the beginning of the Trump administration, January 2017, which shouldn't have happened. It was a great crime. Diplomacy relegated to a 10th order priority, lack of training, and a predilection, not just by President Trump, but I think of many of our more recent presidents, to default to the use of force and to default to intelligence as opposed to diplomacy. Colin Powell had a wonderful way when he was Secretary of State of talking about this. I worked for him when I was ambassador to NATO. He would say, you know, we've got a lot of assets in the world. We want to have strong intelligence, strong military, and strong diplomacy. Diplomacy, said, should be on point for America, and the military should be in reserve. And Powell thought, exhaust diplomacy, and only when you can't resolve a problem diplomatically and it's vital, then you might think about using force. That was the right way to think about it. I know that President Biden, Vice President Harris, and our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, when he's confirmed, they're onto this. I think you'll see a major push by the Biden administration to elevate the State Department, to boost its morale, to hire new people, to provide the adequate funding and training that it needs. And I think they will default in many ways, as they should, to diplomacy before we think about, after 2 terrible land wars and American soldiers killed, wounded in great numbers around the world in the war against terrorist groups of the last 20 years, it's a time for diplomacy. Members of Congress in both parties, particularly the Democratic Party, Hakeem Jeffrey, the new chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Joaquin Castro, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, Elizabeth Warren, who wrote an entire op-ed when she was a candidate for president about the State Department, about the need to support it. I think we're going to see a lot of new support. It's going to be a great thing for our young men and women who are serving it.
Thank you. By the way, for those of you who wish to answer a question, just put it in chat. I'm monitoring it, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Most people, or most people are asking about the Middle East, Israel, and the Palestinians.
Well, do we have 3 months or 3 years? I expected this question. It's a vital question. I'll just try to be brief through and say what's on my mind. I think it's very positive that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco have now recognized the state of Israel. High time. We who support Israel, and I do, have always wanted for Israel, from Harry Truman on down, to see it accepted in the community of nations. It's been rejected by most of the world for most of its history. So congratulations to the Trump administration for pulling this off. I think it is a rare diplomatic victory. It's certainly good for Israel. Having said that, I remain deeply opposed to the moving our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Harry Truman said, we will not do that. And no president did until Donald Trump. Truman said, we won't recognize anyone's sovereignty over Jerusalem until it's resolved peacefully at the negotiating table between the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. Trump moved too fast. I am deeply opposed to the fact that Donald Trump cut off all American economic assistance to the Palestinian people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. Libby and I lived in Jerusalem. Our daughter Elizabeth, who I think is online tonight, was born in Jerusalem in the mid-1980s when I ran the American Aid Program. The Palestinians depend on this. We have always been open-hearted about them. We've always given economic assistance. We've been the leading funder of the United Nations Refugee Relief and Works Agency, which runs the Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. We defunded that effort. We have become, under President Trump, so one-sided that we've lost the respect of the Palestinians, and I think we have to try to regain it. And I remember when Prime Minister Netanyahu was threatening to annex the West Bank settlements back 4 or 5 months ago during our presidential campaign, effectively take the 500,000 or 600,000 people who live on illegal settlements, Israelis, in the Palestinian West Bank, take them, annex that territory, and annex it to the state of Israel. Joe Biden came out with a statement during the campaign opposing that wholeheartedly and very clearly. And I should just also say, Drew, I chair a Boston-based organization called Our Generation Speaks. And we train at Brandeis University young Israelis and young Palestinians to come together on the Brandeis campus, 20 Palestinians, 20 Israelis, to live together and create joint ventures together, business joint ventures, in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And we're supported by an extraordinary number of people in the Boston Jewish community, the New England community, and others around the country. I succeeded our great governor, Deval Patrick, as chairman of this organization. We need to be even-handed, and this organization has taught me, reminded me of the importance that you can be a friend of Israel and also be a friend of the Palestinians. Donald Trump forgot that lesson in high school and college if he was paying attention.
Thank you for that. Moving, staying in the same area, a few questions about Iran.
I actually have hawkish views about the Iranians based on my own experience as an American diplomat. I hope that we will have a bipartisan effort in the Congress to support President Biden. And I hope what we will do is try to contain Iran's power in the Middle East. It's the great Shia power. It's trying to punch a hole in the Sunni world. The Iranians are supporting terrorism and violent activities in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and in Libya, in 6 different Sunni majority countries in the Middle East. The Iranians are stoking mayhem. And so I think we have a responsibility to protect Israel, help it protect itself. It's a very powerful state, and protect some of the Arab countries. I'm not suggesting we fight a war with Iran. I don't think we should. But at least we should be strong enough militarily to contain this Iranian problem. On the nuclear issue, I support President Biden when he says, I'm already calling him President Biden the night before he's inaugurated, when he says that we ought to go back, if we can, to the Iran nuclear deal of July 2015. That deal was not perfect, but it shut down the 2 avenues the Iranians have towards a nuclear weapon: the processing of plutonium and the enrichment of uranium, the true routes to produce fissile material. Since we left the agreement, President Trump, the Iranians have been rebuilding their stocks of low enriched uranium, which they could quickly transition to high enriched uranium. They probably have enough, according to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, enough material right now to manufacture over a period of 6 to 9 months about 2 nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs. We ought to go back to the deal, insist that the Iranians stand down and deconstruct their current nuclear facilities, go back to the commitments they made in 2015. If we can get them to do that, I will certainly support President Biden and the British, French, German, Russians, and Chinese who are on our side of the table. But we got to do one more thing. The Iranians are also developing very strong ballistic missiles, and they represent a threat, those missiles, to everybody in the Middle East and most people in Europe, either through the new Iran nuclear negotiations or in a side deal. We ought to try to pressure the Iranians to limit the development and the usefulness of those ballistic missiles. Israel is under real threat. I was in the Golan Heights and up on the Israeli-Lebanon border with the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, 14 months ago, and saw the challenge that the Israelis are facing from Hezbollah, the Iranian creation, as well as from the Revolutionary Guards that are just below, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards just below Israel in Syria on the Golan Heights. There's a real security issue there. So it's complicated for the United States. On the one hand, we've got to contain Iran on the terrorist threat. On the other, we're going to have to deal with them and talk to them and work with them on the nuclear deal, in my judgment.
Thank you for that. Some questions on NATO and especially Turkey and Hungary having full membership there.
Well, we are in the extraordinarily difficult position right now in NATO, where 3 of the NATO allies, and we have 29 allies in NATO now, along with Canada and the 28 Europeans, Hungary, Poland, and Turkey are all taking on the vestiges of authoritarian states, particularly Hungary, which has become an unfree state. So the question is, in a democratic alliance, what should we do about that? We operate by consensus at NATO, meaning any decision has to be one where everybody agrees. That is a very good reason for that. You don't want to go to war and be on the losing end of a vote to go to war and then have to go anyway. And so you want everyone to agree before we march off to war, or in the case of 9/11, to defend the United States. So if the United States tabled a resolution against the authoritarian regime in Hungary, our NATO ally, and wanted to deny Hungary NATO financial support, Hungary would certainly not agree, would simply not agree. They could veto the resolution and it wouldn't happen. We've just issued a report at Harvard Kennedy School, along with the German Council on Foreign Relations, a report that I shared with my colleague Daniela Schwarzer from Berlin, advocating that the European Union and NATO find a way to sanction and penalize financially Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. 3 of them members of NATO, two of them members of the European Union, Hungary and Poland. If we don't do that, then we simply feed the beast of the increasing authoritarian politics of many of the countries of Eastern Europe. And we placate and don't defend those countries, and we don't defend the West Europeans who are fighting off these far-right populist anti-democratic groups that I referred to earlier. So I think it's really actually a very important point of principle for us, Drew.
On the flip side of that, how can we restore our relationships with Germany and France and other members of NATO after 4 years of this current administration?
It's a really good question, and we've got to do that because these are among the closest allies and friends that we have in the world. And I think all of us know the damage that President Trump did. I particularly am sensitive to his unceasing criticism of Angela Merkel. You have to believe that part of it was misogynistic if you just divine the personality and the life of Trump. But to try to injure her politically, as he tried to do, didn't work. She's the most respected leader in Europe. I think if you took a vote of the G20 leaders, you know, Putin and Xi Jinping and Modi and Bolsonaro, and there was a secret vote, and you ask them, who do you respect the most around this table? They'd probably vote for Angela Merkel. And we were so proud at Harvard at our commencement in 2019, the last commencement we were able to hold, when she was the honored guest and she received an honorary degree and she spoke to our graduates and our community, so proud that she stood on our stage in Cambridge. She's a great leader. She's stepping down at the end of September of this year. And it's going to be a great loss for Germany, but also for German-American relations and for Europe. I think Joe Biden, he's invested in NATO. I was with him a year and a half ago at the last Munich Security Conference, February 2019. He gave a big speech in front of about 1,000 European leaders of all stripes. And he said, there's another America beyond Donald Trump. There's an America that supports NATO. In recent public opinion polls, Chicago Council, this year, 2020, 75% of Americans say they support NATO, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. You can't get 75% of Americans to say the sky is blue, but we got them to say that they support NATO, I think because Trump has been so antagonistic to it and so unceasing in his criticism that Americans know in their hearts, of course we support NATO. And so I think Joe Biden is going to support that institution. Here's the last thing I'd say in the difficulty. The governments will come back. Macron, Merkel, Boris Johnson, Justin Trudeau are going to embrace Joe Biden, for sure. But the peoples of these countries, they're skeptical of us. We walked out of the World Health Organization when they needed us the most. We walked out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and that's the #1 issue in Europe for citizens. It's climate change, and we walked out on that. We elected Trump. And they fear that maybe we'll elect him or someone like him in 2024. I think that's the harder task for us, is to win back confidence in the people of Europe and Canada in the NATO alliance. The leaders will accept Joe Biden, and Biden will do his best to convince people that America's back. But I think many Europeans and Canadians are skeptical for all the reasons we've just recounted.
Again, shifting gears, questions on China, influence in Latin America, and their human rights violations.
Well, the Belt and Road Initiative that I think all of us are aware of, that's the Chinese vehicle for Chinese investments in places in Brazil, for instance, where they're the leading trade partner now, replacing the United States, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or Central and South Asia, or Southeast Asia. Even in Europe, I was at the Port of Piraeus a couple of years ago. You know who owns it, runs it now under a contract, the state government? A Chinese state company. So the tentacles of Belt Road, it's the most ambitious idea in the world today. It's the biggest project that any government has unleashed. And my view is compete. That's what Kennedy did when he came into office in 1961. He looked at the Soviets and their space program. His answer was not to complain about it. His answer was say, within a decade, we're going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. And he achieved it posthumously. So if we're worried about Chinese influence in Latin America and Africa and other places, and we should be, because they're ripping off many of these countries and they're using Chinese labor, and it's leading to long-term indebtedness of many of these countries. Look at Sri Lanka, look at Myanmar, to the Chinese state. We should compete and offer a better alternative. One of the ideas in this report we've just issued with the German Council on Foreign Relations, this is Harvard Kennedy School, is why don't the United States and the European Union and Japan band together, maybe with India too? We're the biggest economic blocs in the world. Let's offer our own Belt and Road, one that will have concessional lending, that will not lead to long-term indebtedness. And we're not going to bring our labor force over to build the sports stadium or the subway line or the factory. We'll use local labor. I think that would be my answer. Compete with the Chinese. I would bank on us and our democratic allies over the Chinese if we would make the effort.
And their human rights violations?
Well, I think we have to say that China's the greatest human rights violator in the world today. Hong Kong, certainly in Xinjiang province, the decimation of Uyghur culture, the incarceration, Human Rights Watch and others believe over 1 million people incarcerated just because of who they are. Ethnic Uyghur, Muslims, citizens of China, the enforced re-education of these people, separating husbands from wives, parents from kids. Think about the Chinese labor system and penal system, the use of labor by imprisoned people. It's the biggest human rights violator in the world today. And, you know, I want to live in peace in China, with China. We all should. We can't think about the use of force. I know Steve Bannon wants us to decouple everything we do from the Chinese. It's just not going to be possible. But we've been silent on these human rights issues. There hasn't been a single word that Donald Trump has uttered of criticism of Xi Jinping on Hong Kong or on the Uyghurs. Not a single word of criticism on Alexei Navalny, this incredibly courageous Russian opposition leader who was nearly killed in a Novichok nerve agent attack 5 months ago, and who went back to Moscow on Sunday afternoon with his wife and was arrested. He knew he'd be arrested. He's willing to go to prison. Trump hasn't stood up for him, haven't stood up for the people of Belarus who've been demonstrating every single weekend for 7 months for freedom. And Joe Biden's going to stand up for them. Human rights is going to be back on the agenda with the Russians and the Chinese, and it's about time.
And Taiwan?
It's such a fascinating issue. You know, throughout most of my career, and I was at one point, as you said, Drew, the State Department spokesperson, you know, we lived by the deal that President Nixon made with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai in February 1972, that the United States would no longer recognize Taiwan. You remember this deal, the 3 communiques from 1972? We would not recognize Taiwan as the representative of the Chinese people. We'd recognize solely the People's Republic, that we would have no official relationship with Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. The Taiwan Relations Act was then passed by Congress in 1972, and that does allow the United States to provide defensive arms to the Taiwanese. I think a lot of people now in the United States in both parties, this is a bipartisan issue, bipartisanship, and in Japan, and in South Korea, and in Europe are now really worried. If this is what the Chinese do to Hong Kong, if the Chinese rip up the agreement they made with the United Kingdom on June 30th, 1997, the date of the handover, and they extinguish Hong Kong's democracy in a matter of months, are they ready in the next 5 to 10 years or even sooner to invade Taiwan? And I think the answer from us has to be, leave the Chinese in doubt as to whether or not the United States would defend Taiwan. And just, you want to build doubt in the minds of the Chinese leadership in order to get them to back off. And we should be supplying the Taiwanese with the weapons and technology that they need to defend themselves. One retired American general told me this past summer, we need to make Taiwan a tough nut to crack. Make their island defenses so formidable that the cost would be so high to China that the Chinese won't attempt an overt military invasion. They may end up doing what they've been doing for decades now, try to subvert Taiwan from within. But that is a great democracy on that island. It's one of the world's best democracies. On the coronavirus, maybe the best record of any government in the world is the government of Taiwan. Think of the importance of the semiconductor industry and the scientific and technological community on Taiwan to the global economy. It's an important place. And I do sense, Drew, on the issue of China and what China is doing with its authoritarian dictatorship, I sense Republicans and Democrats coming together. It's not true that they can't work together in Washington on anything. I think on China, on Russia, most Republicans and Democrats agree we need to compete with China, contain Russia, and certainly on the issue of NATO, there's bipartisan consensus that we should be an active member and a leader. So hopefully Joe Biden will be able to work with Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney and the other Republicans on these types of issues. We should want bipartisanship in Washington.
One more foreign question before turning to the United States, Brexit.
Gosh, what an incredible issue this is. I just say three. I've been thinking a lot about this. My class and I have discussed it over several years now. I say three things very quickly. Number one, of course, Britain is going to suffer because of Brexit. Britain lives next door, and until December 31st was a member of the largest economy in the world. The EU economy is larger than that of the United States or China. Britain was the second most powerful member economy and the most powerful military. Britain's going to be a short and mid and long-term loser for leaving because now they have to live with those trade relationships and yet have no say, no power, but they'll have to live under EU trade laws. And that's going to be disadvantageous for Britain. That's point one. Point two, the EU is going to suffer as well. Britain, I think, was the most globally oriented of all the EU countries, perhaps because of the distant legacy in terms of mindset of the empire, but in more current times because of the Commonwealth and because Britain's military and intelligence capacity, which is global. And so Europe is going to be weaker without Britain. And third, and this is particularly important for a state like ours, where about half the population tells the census that a little bit of them or a big part of them is Irish. What is the possibility that, say, 10 or 15 years from now, this country called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be the United Kingdom of England and Wales? Because there's a fair chance that Scotland is going to have a referendum under the brilliant leadership of Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party, very effective political party, and vote to secede. There are 5 million Scots. They're pro-European. They would outnumber the Danes, for instance. They wouldn't be the smallest country in the EU, and they're a trading people. What's even more intriguing for those of us who are Irish American, and I am, 2 Irish grandparents, the Irish population in Northern Ireland is going to outnumber the Protestant population quite soon. The birth rates are much higher on the Catholic side. There is tremendous emigration of the Protestants out of Northern Ireland to Britain and to the United States and other parts of the world. The economic engine 100 years ago, when Ireland was being born as a free republic, the economic engine then was the North, was Belfast and Londonderry and other cities. The economic engine now is Dublin, the Celtic Tiger. It's a powerhouse. It's where every American company wants to be. Ireland's still in the EU. Ireland becomes the bridge to the EU that the UK used to be. And what is the possibility that Ireland will unite under a capital in Dublin, one people, Catholic and Protestant, in one country? It's been the dream for hundreds of years. And a lot of my British friends believe that's where the situation is heading. So you ask about Brexit? This incredible country, our great friend, the United Kingdom, pieced together in its current constitutional structure in the Act of Union of 1707, might just almost disappear, at least Scotland and Ireland, in the next 10 to 15 years. It's going to be incredible to watch. And as an Irish American, of course, you want justice. You want to see the Irish succeed. I certainly do. But you don't want to see Britain weakened either, because they've been such an important, and still are, important friend to us. So I think it's one of the most fascinating issues in the world today. My class and I have been debating this for a number of years.
Okay. Sorry, one more question outside the US. Africa, what do you see the issues there?
We need to rearrange how we think of that continent. I'm betting that in the next 20, 30 years, Nigeria, certainly, and the population of Nigeria is going to double in the next 40 years, is going to be considered one of the 10 most powerful countries in the world by mid-century. I'll bet the same about South Africa. There's a technological leap underway in Africa right now, leap forward. Educational rates are at their highest ever. There are plenty of problems, and we could recount them in great detail. But the positive trend lines in Africa are noticeable. They're inspiring. We should think of Africa as actually one of the more hopeful regions of the world in some respects. Tremendous poverty, tremendous HIV still, other communicable diseases that lots of people are working, river blindness, to try to eradicate. Lack of opportunity, sure, absolutely. And they face extraordinary problems with the population explosion, because not only will the population of Nigeria double, the population of sub-Saharan Africa will double in the next 40 years. And so Africa, by the end of this century, will be one of the major population centers in the world. And Nigeria, one of the largest countries by population in the world, there are going to be tremendous challenges, but there's a tremendous upside to see the growth technologically, educationally, business-wise, throughout East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa in particular.
So turning to the United States, can the Democrats and Republicans work together?
I hope so. I fear not. I've outlined a couple of areas where in foreign policy, I think they're already working together. But, we've always had less of a problem of the two parties working together in foreign policy. It's really been the domestic agenda that has separated them. I fear that those 160 Republicans in the House who dishonored their oath to the Constitution by failing to certify the election, that they'll just see 2022 as the next battlefront. And then beginning tomorrow, they'll be contesting that election. And they'll try to engineer a Republican victory in the House and Senate in the midterm elections, which are historically, as we all know, unfriendly to most sitting presidents. I would hope that given the four crises we spoke about at the beginning of this talk, the pandemic, the recession, the racial crisis, and our constitutional crisis, that patriotic Republicans would give Joe Biden a chance and work with him on each of those four, including the last one, to make sure that that the FBI and the Justice Department are able to find these violent people who tried to overthrow our democracy. Call it sedition, call it a coup, call it an insurrection, or whatever it was a threat to our democracy. I hope that they will. I hope that Republicans will see the wisdom in a very large stimulus package of well over $1 trillion. Joe Biden wants 1.9 trillion because most economists say this is the time to spend when the country's on its back and people need help. I fear that I think there'll be some Republicans who will support the president. I fear many will not. And maybe we should alter the way we understand our politics, because it may be that 7 or 8 women and men in the Senate who sit in the middle of the political spectrum will be the kingmakers. Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Susan Collins, and Angus King, both the senators from Maine, Mitt Romney, our former governor. And I just have to say, boy, has he stood up, both on impeachment, the first round, and also on his magnificent speech on the evening of January 6th. And so it may be that a combination of Republicans and Democrats are going to hold the balance in a 50-50 Senate where Kamala Harris can break a tie, but that's all she can do as president of the Senate. It's going to be really important to tackle any one of those four crises that the president has to have the capacity to act. And so I think it's almost a patriotic duty to support him right now for members of both parties.
Questions keep coming in. So once again, leaving the country and going back out into the world, Modi's India.
Another fascinating question. Look, in a lot of ways, the story of the rise of India is just so inspiring to see the technological growth, the business power, the rise in the standard of living, the alleviation of poverty. What was it when they had their last election? 750 million people voted. That's nearly twice the population of the United States who voted. Greatest democracy in the world. There's so much to recommend it. And I was really proud as a diplomat to be part of the team that was present at the creation of our new relationship with India in the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, and President Obama and even Donald Trump continued this tradition of building a stronger US-India relationship. Here's the kicker. India is the largest country in the world by population, just now overtaking China. It's obviously got a Hindu majority, but it has a very important Muslim minority. Second largest Muslim population anywhere in the world is in India. In 30 years, the largest Muslim population in the world, larger than Nigeria or Indonesia, will be in India. And under the BJP government, the Hindu government, majority government, there are many, many steps taken to weaken the position of the Muslims. And so that's a real problem for India, for its very sensitive religious balance. And it's a problem for the United States. Here's the way I think we should talk about it. I wrote an op-ed with my friend Anya Manuel about this in the autumn. We decided not to preach from inside our glass house to the Indians, given what we were doing in the United States, how we were falling down in our democracy. So we just said, this could be, by the end of the century, the most important American friend in the world, India. When we're long gone and our kids and grandchildren have taken over, they might see the Indians as our most important friend in the world. And so what do both of us have to do? Well, we Americans have to acknowledge our failings on race, on our Constitution, and we need to do better to heal our fractured society. And that's what Indians should do too. We decided it just wouldn't make sense, and we would have no moral credibility in Americans just preaching from on high when we've fallen so low. And I think both of our big democracies have a fault line that we need to recognize and repair. That's maybe the way to look at this issue.
So two final questions. One on the youth of America being a little disappointed in our generation, and also how they see maybe service in the State Department. You know, what would you say to young people to try to get them to do what you did 40 years ago?
Well, the good news here is that since I spent a lot of time with millennials, Libby and I have 3 millennial daughters, but I also teach millennials and spend time with them. There is no shortage among our millennial population in the United States of people who want to go into the government, who want to create their own nonprofits. They are passionate about gender equality, about racial equality, about LGBTQ rights. It's inspiring to see that in this younger generation. They're passionate about climate change, absolutely passionate. Maybe we were passionate about the Cold War 30 and 40 years ago. This is what they're passionate about. And it bothers me that so many, it's almost become a joke, right? Among our set, the baby boomers, love to complain about the millennials. And yet there's so much virtue in them. I would say, this is hard, I haven't proven this. I think they're much more politically engaged than at least my generation was in the 70s. I came after the 60s. And they're much more ready to do something about it. if we had the largest demonstrations in the history of the country this past summer, and we did, in the history of the country, who was out there? The millennials were out there in the biggest numbers. So they sit in my class, and you know who's in the front row? The immigrant Americans, the first generation Americans, the refugee Americans. And the most inspiring thing I do is to go to work every day when I used to be able to go to work. And now I just go to work on the Zoom platform. But I'm a defender of this group. I think they're going to change the world. And I guess in self-defense, speaking for the older people here like me, we brought the Cold War to a peaceful end. Democracy triumphed in Eastern Europe. 150 million people were set free because we held fast during the Cold War. We had the space program. A lot of boomers created the technology revolution. I know there are problems with Facebook and social media, but boy, has technology changed our lives for the better. I think our generation can be proud of what we've done, but we recognize, Drew, of course, where we've fallen down. I started my whole talk today talking about how we fell down. So, you know, I think that the image in our minds we should have, those of us who are older, and a lot of us are parents of millennial kids, is this is the great relay race in our society. We're just about to hand off that baton. We're rounding the last stretch. Our arm is outstretched with the baton. The millennials will grab it. They'll run the laps, and then they'll hand it off to our grandchildren 20 to 30 years from now. And as long as they're imbued with the patriotism and ideals of our country, you know, they'll carry us forward. We'll have to trust them, and I do trust that generation.
And a final question, not to end on a down note, but what are you, many things might pop up, but what are you most worried about?
Okay, I'll answer this question, but I'm going to end on a high note because
Thank you.
Libby's listening to this right now, and she came to a talk I gave at Harvard 6-7 years ago when I ended on a down note by talking about all the terrible problems we're facing. And we were walking home from Harvard University to our house in Blakesley Street. And I said, how'd that go? She said, you're depressing everybody. She said, what are you hopeful about? And she said, I get that the world is full of problems. That's fine. You got to focus on that. But what are you hopeful about? So here's how I'll answer your question. It's a very good question. At the end of every semester, every course I teach, I poll my students and I say, tell me what you're hopeful about. Because our classes are full of problems. Climate change, war in the Middle East, Iran and North Korea with nuclear weapons, the rise of China as the major human rights violator, Putin encroaching on the East Europeans. I mean, you name it, lots of problems. HIV, right? The pandemic. That's what I'm worried about. And I'm worried about the refusal of Donald Trump to put the greatness of America in the service of these causes like climate change. That's why tomorrow's so important. So at the end of every semester, I email my students, tell me what you're hopeful about. And I always put up in the last class, here's what you are hopeful about. And in December, on Zoom, 56 students from 19 countries, all millennials, here's what they're hopeful about, and we should be too. And we'll end on this, Drew, to make everybody feel okay.
Great.
Tonight. Our students very hopeful about the rise of women. It's not happening everywhere, but it's beginning to happen. And we have the first cabinet in the United States that's nearly 50% women. We can be hopeful about that. Our students very hopeful about the alleviation of poverty. More people in the world, more than 1 billion, lifted out of poverty in the last 40 years, China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, than any other period, any other time in the world. That's number 2. Number 3, this sounds counterintuitive given the fact we're in a pandemic. Our students very hopeful about global public health. Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca and Oxford are creating vaccines in record time, shaving years off. It's a modern miracle. But my students would say, we can eradicate polio in the next 3 to 5 years. It only exists in 3 countries, and we've not eradicated a global disease since smallpox. And we can make people with HIV live purposeful lives and be able to live with their affliction and not die from it if they're treated properly with retroviral drugs. And my students passionate about that. And it's interesting. They're passionate about technology. That was the last area of vote getters. As I'm older, I tend to see technology as a double-edged sword. I see the uses, utility, and marvel at it. But you see the downside of gene editing, the ethical concerns, for instance, of gene editing. Our students believe passionately that technologically they can remake the world. My students say quite confidently, we can have a clean global energy economy by 2050. We can end the fossil fuel dominance, and they will do that. And we can cure most types of cancer. So let us glory in what's happening, the hopeful global trend lines that are right out there in front of us. If we would just go out and engage the world again with a smile on our face and maybe a Zoom elbow, not a hand, outstretched to the rest of the world, that's going to be Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and their team. And I couldn't be more hopeful tonight that we're just about to, we can reimagine and revive our country, and let's move forward. So I'm hopeful tonight, and I wanted to end on that note, Drew.
Yeah, I just read on Twitter, somebody tweeted that it feels like Christmas Eve.
That's right.
Nick,
And thanks for
thank you
having
so
me,
much.
Drew.
Thank you so much for this. It's been wonderful. You've been very kind with your time and your expertise. And the library thanks you, the citizens of Cambridge thank you, and everyone who attended thanks you as well.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Maria. And thanks, everybody. And thanks to Brooks and Jeannie and Dan and all my friends, Sophia, who are here tonight, too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good to see you and Libby looking well.